The first hard wind of autumn swept across the Wyoming prairie like a warning whispered by heaven itself. Tall grass bent beneath its breath, dry leaves tumbled across the dusty trail, and dark clouds gathered slowly over the distant mountains. Winter had not yet arrived, but every rancher in the valley knew it was close enough to taste in the cold air. On a lonely ranch nearly 15 miles from the nearest town, Samuel Whitaker struggled to close a weathered wooden gate while a small herd of cattle shuffled toward their pasture. At 73, every movement demanded effort. His hands, once powerful enough to rope wild longhorns, now trembled from age. The old injury in his back flared with every twist, reminding him that time always collected its debts. His wife, Martha, hurried across the yard carrying a lantern despite the fading daylight. She was 68, her silver hair tucked beneath a faded bonnet, her face marked by gentle wrinkles earned through decades of hardship rather than bitterness. Though she smiled whenever Samuel looked her way, she often pressed a hand against her chest whenever he turned away. She had hidden the pains growing inside her for nearly a year. She refused to let him worry about another burden. The Whitaker Ranch had once been one of the busiest spreads in the valley. There had been laughter then. Horses in every corral. Cowboys riding before sunrise. Neighbors stopping by for coffee and stories. Most of all, there had been their son, Daniel. Daniel had inherited Samuel's steady hands and Martha's quiet heart. Everyone believed the ranch would belong to him one day. Instead, 6 years earlier, a violent cattle stampede during a summer thunderstorm had stolen his life before his 29th birthday. The ranch had never truly recovered. Neither had his parents. Since then, buildings had slowly fallen into disrepair. Fence posts leaned. Barn roofs sagged. Every year the herd became smaller because two aging people simply could not manage what once required an entire crew. That afternoon Samuel leaned heavily against the fence and watched the cattle wander toward the pasture. "I think this will be our last winter here," he said quietly. Martha looked away before answering. "You've been thinking about selling." "I've been trying not to." Neither spoke for several moments. Selling the ranch felt less like losing land than burying Daniel all over again. Samuel stared toward the empty barn where his son's saddle still hung untouched. "I promised him this place would stay in the family." Martha gently rested her hand over his. "You kept that promise as long as you could." Before Samuel could answer, one of the calves suddenly pushed through a broken section of fence. Another followed. Then 3 more. "Oh no." Samuel grabbed his rope and hurried after them, but his stiff leg gave way on the uneven ground. He stumbled hard against the fence post. The frightened calves bolted toward a rocky ravine where coyotes often hunted. By the time Samuel regained his footing, they were nearly out of sight. Then a sharp whistle echoed across the valley. Horse hoofs thundered over the prairie. A rider appeared from the western trail, urging a tired bay horse into a swift but controlled gallop. Instead of chasing the calves wildly, the stranger circled wide, cutting off their escape route with remarkable precision. His movements were calm, almost effortless. Another whistle. The horse responded instantly. The calves slowed. Within minutes every frightened animal had been turned gently back toward the pasture without a single rope being thrown. Samuel stood speechless. The rider dismounted beside the broken fence. He looked about 34 years old, broad-shouldered, with wind-darkened skin and tired blue eyes that seemed far older than the rest of him. His coat had been patched so many times that little of the original fabric remained. Dust covered his boots. His beard had grown rough from weeks on the trail. Yet despite his appearance, every movement carried quiet discipline. He removed his hat before speaking. "Afternoon, sir." Samuel nodded cautiously. "You handle cattle well." "I've been around them most of my life." The stranger glanced toward the damaged fence. "Looks like that's where they got through." Without asking permission, he gathered several loose boards lying nearby and began repairing the opening with practiced hands. Samuel watched silently. The repairs were neither rushed nor careless. Every nail was driven straight. Every board fit tightly despite the worn lumber. Only after finishing did the stranger turn back. "My name's Elias Carter." Samuel offered no smile. "What do you want?" Elias hesitated only briefly. "A place to stay." Samuel's expression hardened. "We don't hire hands anymore." "I'm not asking for wages." "We don't rent rooms either." "I don't need one." Samuel folded his arms. "Then what exactly are you asking?" Elias looked toward the cattle grazing peacefully beyond the fence. "Let me stay, and I'll take care of your cattle." The words hung quietly between them. Samuel almost laughed. "You expect me to trust a drifter I met 5 minutes ago?" "No. You could steal every animal I've got. I could. You admit it. I won't lie just because the truth sounds dangerous. Samuel narrowed his eyes. You've got nerve. I've got honesty. For the first time Martha stepped closer. Her eyes lingered on Elias's exhausted horse. The poor animal's ribs showed beneath its dusty coat. The saddlebags hanging from its sides looked nearly empty. Have you eaten today? She asked softly. Elias smiled politely. I've had enough. It was the kind of answer people gave when they had eaten nothing at all. Samuel noticed it too. You passing through? I was. And now? I've been looking for somewhere worth stopping. Samuel shook his head. Keep riding. Martha looked disappointed but remained silent. Elias simply nodded. I understand. He placed his hat back on his head and led his horse toward the road without another word. Neither Samuel nor Martha expected to see him again. The sun had nearly disappeared when loud barking erupted near the eastern pasture. Samuel hurried outside. Several frightened calves were running once more. Beyond them 3 hungry coyotes had slipped through another weak section of fencing. Before Samuel could grab his rifle, Elias came racing back across the field. He had already mounted his tired horse. Using nothing more than swift turns, loud whistles, and fearless riding, he forced the coyotes away from the herd without firing a single shot. The predators vanished into the gathering darkness. Elias rode back slowly. You've got more broken fence lines than you realize. Samuel frowned. You came back. I couldn't leave knowing those calves wouldn't survive the night. Again he asked for nothing. Instead, he spent nearly an hour reinforcing another stretch of fencing while the sky darkened overhead. When he finally finished, his hands were bleeding from splintered wood. Martha stepped onto the porch carrying a steaming bowl. Please. Elias hesitated. I haven't earned supper. You saved our herd twice. She held the bowl toward him. You've earned stew. Elias accepted it with both hands. Thank you, He ate slowly, almost gratefully, never taking more than careful spoonfuls. Samuel noticed something unusual. The stranger kept glancing toward his horse before every bite. Halfway through the meal Elias quietly stood, walked to the tired animal, and fed it nearly half of his cornbread. Only afterward did he finish eating. Later, Martha found an old blanket. He can sleep in the hay barn, she whispered. Samuel sighed heavily. One night. Just one. No closer to the house. She smiled gently. Fair enough. That night rain began tapping softly against the barn roof. Samuel could not sleep. Near midnight he looked through the window toward the barn. A faint lantern glowed inside. Curious, he quietly walked across the yard. Through a crack in the wooden wall he saw Elias sitting on an overturned bucket. An old ranch dog, thin enough to count every rib, had wandered into the barn. Without hesitation Elias broke apart the last biscuit Martha had given him and placed every piece before the starving animal. The dog devoured it eagerly. Elias merely smiled. I reckon you needed it more than I did. He drank only water before blowing out the lantern. Samuel returned to the house without saying a word. Before dawn he awoke as usual, expecting another difficult morning. Instead, something felt strangely different. The yard was already alive. Smoke drifted from neatly stacked firewood beside the shed. Fresh water filled every trough. The horses had been brushed. The barn floor had been swept clean. Even the broken wagon wheel leaning against the fence had somehow been repaired. Elias. Martha called. No answer came. Samuel mounted his horse and rode toward the northern pasture. As he reached the top of a low hill, he spotted the drifter standing perfectly still beside the grazing cattle. Elias wasn't watching the herd. He was staring toward the distant ridgeline. Samuel followed his gaze. 3 riders sat motionless nearly a mile away. Each carried a rifle. One slowly raised a pair of field glasses toward the Whitaker ranch. The other pointed directly at the cattle. Without taking his eyes off them, Elias spoke quietly. They've been watching this place since sunrise. Samuel's stomach tightened. Who are they? Elias's voice became grave. Cattle rustlers. The 3 strangers turned their horses and disappeared beyond the hills. Elias continued staring after them. They're not passing through. A long silence settled over the prairie. Then he said the words that made Samuel's blood run cold. They'll be back. The warning lingered over the Whitaker ranch long after the 3 riders disappeared beyond the hills. Samuel stood motionless beside Elias, staring at the empty ridgeline where the strangers had vanished. You know them? He finally asked. Elias kept watching the horizon. I know their kind. You've crossed paths before? Enough to recognize how they work. Samuel swallowed hard. They'll come after the cattle? They won't rush. Elias crouched beside a hoofprint near the hilltop. They'll watch first. He brushed loose dirt aside. They've already counted the herd. Samuel's face tightened. How can you tell? They only rode close enough to see numbers. He stood again. If they wanted to kill us yesterday, they would've. A cold silence settled between them. They're waiting for the right night. Back at the ranch house, Martha poured coffee into 3 worn cups. When Elias stepped inside, he remained standing near the doorway instead of taking a seat. Samuel noticed. You can sit. I'd rather stand. You afraid the chair might break? A faint smile crossed Elias's face. No, sir. Then sit. Elias quietly accepted the invitation. It was the first time all 3 shared breakfast together. Afterward, Samuel unfolded an old map of the ranch across the kitchen table. Show me. Elias studied it carefully. His finger moved across faded fence lines. The north pasture needs stronger posts. He pointed farther west. This windmill barely reaches half the herd. Then toward the southern creek. That crossing is too open. Samuel blinked. You figured all this out in one day? I've been watching. Martha quietly watched the 2 men lean over the map together. For the first time in years, Samuel wasn't making every decision alone. That afternoon work began before sunrise. Elias replaced broken fence posts with heavy cedar logs cut from nearby timber. He repaired sagging gates. He cleaned neglected watering troughs until fresh spring water flowed clearly again. He climbed onto the old windmill despite fierce winds and repaired its frozen gears before sunset. Samuel shook his head in disbelief. I've been meaning to fix that for 3 years. Elias only smiled. It wasn't waiting for tomorrow. Within a week the ranch had begun changing. Grass that had been trampled unevenly was divided into proper grazing sections. Weak calves received separate feeding pens. Old harnesses were repaired instead of discarded. Even the horses seemed calmer under Elias's care. One morning Martha stepped outside carrying fresh laundry. She stopped in surprise. A scruffy black and white border collie sat patiently beside Elias. The dog had once wandered the valley stealing scraps from every ranch. No one had ever managed to tame him. Now he waited silently for commands. Elias pointed toward several wandering calves. Easy. The dog moved without barking. He circled carefully. Within moments every calf had been guided back toward the herd. Martha laughed aloud. I've never seen that dog listen to anyone. Elias scratched behind the collie's ears. He only needed someone to trust. The word stayed with Martha long after she returned inside. Sometimes she wondered if Elias had really been speaking about the dog. As weeks passed, strange stories began drifting through the valley. Mrs. Bennett, a widow living alone beside the river, visited one afternoon carrying fresh pies. I thought you'd hired a whole crew, she said. Samuel frowned. We haven't. The man staying here repaired my roof. Samuel looked toward Elias. You did. Elias shrugged. It was leaking. Mrs. Bennett continued. He left before sunrise. I never asked. He refused payment. Another rancher arrived 2 days later. My wagon axle broke near Miller's Creek. Samuel listened quietly. The drifter from your place fixed it. Again Elias simply smiled. It wasn't much work. The stories continued. Someone had stacked firewood outside the schoolhouse. A broken church fence had mysteriously been rebuilt overnight. A poor family found smoked beef hanging from their porch after the season's hunting failed. Nobody ever saw who delivered it. But nearly everyone suspected the quiet drifter living at Whitaker Ranch. Elias never admitted any of it. Winter arrived early. The first heavy snowstorm swept across the valley with blinding winds. Visibility disappeared within minutes. Samuel looked nervously toward the pasture. The longhorn bull. His heart sank. The largest breeding bull had broken through drifting snow fences earlier that morning. Now he was somewhere beyond the western meadow. If we lose him. I'm going. Elias was already saddling his horse. I'll help, Samuel said. No. I know this land. You also know your back won't survive riding through this storm. Samuel hated hearing the truth. Elias pulled his coat tighter. Keep the fire burning. Then he disappeared into the white wilderness. Hours passed. Snow buried the fences. The wind screamed around the old house. Martha stood beside the window praying quietly. Just before sunset another sound reached them. A horse. Samuel hurried outside. Elias emerged through the blowing snow. Behind him walked the massive longhorn bull. The animal followed calmly despite its enormous size. Samuel smiled with relief. Then his smile vanished. Martha. She had stepped outside carrying blankets. The frightened bull suddenly caught sight of loose canvas blowing across the yard. With a violent snort it charged. Everything happened at once. Samuel shouted. Martha froze. The bull lowered its horns. Before anyone could move, Elias spurred his horse directly across its path. His mount collided sideways with the charging animal. The impact threw Elias violently onto frozen ground. The bull turned toward him instead. Instead of running, Elias grabbed a discarded rope lying beside the corral. He waved it loudly, drawing the animal farther away from Martha. The enraged beast followed. It chased Elias across the icy yard until Samuel finally fired one warning shot into the air. The bull stopped. Seconds later it wandered back toward the pasture. Silence returned. Samuel hurried to Elias. The drifter struggled to sit upright. Blood stained one sleeve. His breathing came painfully. I think. Elias muttered with a strained grin. He won that argument. Martha knelt beside him. You're hurt. I've been worse. You can barely breathe. Samuel helped carry him inside. The town doctor arrived hours later. After examining him, he looked toward Samuel. 2 cracked ribs. He frowned. And a badly bruised shoulder. Martha prepared warm broth. Elias thanked her before falling asleep. Late that evening Samuel entered the guest room carrying another blanket. As he tucked it over Elias, something slipped from beneath the pillow. A silver pocket watch. Samuel picked it up carefully. The engraving caught the firelight. To Captain Elias Carter. Honor never dies. Samuel stared at it. Captain? The following morning, while changing Elias's bandages, Martha noticed more than bruises. Old scars crossed his back. Another stretched across his shoulder. One deep mark ran along his ribs. These were not ranch injuries. These belonged to a soldier. When Elias awoke, he saw the watch resting on the bedside table. Samuel sat quietly nearby. You were an officer. Elias looked at the watch for a long moment. I was. You never mentioned it. You never asked. Samuel nodded slowly. What happened? For several minutes only the crackling fireplace answered. Finally Elias spoke. My unit escorted settlers west. His voice remained steady. Families. Children. We were ambushed. He looked into the flames. We fought. We lost. I couldn't save them. Samuel remained silent. I buried every one of them. The room felt unbearably still. When it was over. Elias swallowed. I resigned. You blamed yourself. I still do. You were outnumbered. I was responsible. Martha reached across the table and gently covered his hand. No. Elias looked at her. A man who keeps saving strangers, Samuel said quietly, doesn't deserve to spend the rest of his life punishing himself. Elias lowered his eyes. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, they saw tears threatening behind them. That evening snow fell softly over the valley. The ranch seemed peaceful. Too peaceful. Near midnight the border collie began barking furiously. Elias was on his feet instantly despite the pain in his ribs. He rushed outside. Orange light suddenly burst across the northern pasture. Fire. Flames raced through dry winter grass. Samuel grabbed buckets. Neighbors came running through the darkness. While everyone fought the fire, distant hoofbeats thundered across the western field. The herd. Samuel shouted. Dozens of cattle were already being driven into the darkness. Masked riders disappeared into the storm. By the time the fire was extinguished, nearly half the Whitaker herd was gone. At sunrise they found something else. The main ranch gate had been hacked with a hunting knife. Carved deeply into the weathered wood were 7 chilling words. Next time, the old couple dies. Samuel stared silently at the message. His hands shook. Beside him, Elias slowly tightened his grip around the old silver pocket watch. The guilt he had carried for years returned to his eyes. But this time, he made himself a promise. He would not fail another family. The morning after the fire felt strangely quiet. Snow covered the burned pasture like a white blanket laid over fresh wounds. Blackened fence posts rose from the frozen ground like gravestones, and the empty grazing field where half the Whitaker herd had once stood seemed unbearably still. Samuel walked the pasture in silence. Every few steps he stopped, staring at hoofprints disappearing toward the western hills. "They took 27 head," he whispered. "They took more than cattle." Martha understood. They had stolen hope. For the first time since Daniel's death, Samuel looked like a man ready to surrender. He stood beside the carved ranch gate for a long while, reading the threatening message again and again. Next time, the old couple dies. Finally he turned toward Elias. "I think they're right." Elias looked up. "I'm too old for this." He slowly removed his hat. "I buried my son. My hands can't hold a rifle steady anymore. I can't protect Martha." His voice cracked. "Maybe it's time to let the ranch go." Martha slipped her arm through his. Neither noticed Elias quietly walking toward the burned pasture. He stood there alone, staring across the valley where the stolen cattle had disappeared. The same guilt that had haunted him for years tried once again to settle into his heart. Another family. Another home. Another chance to fail. He closed his eyes. Then slowly removed the silver pocket watch from his coat. His thumb rested on the engraved words. "Honor never dies." For years he had carried those words like a punishment. Now they felt different. Honor was not something buried in yesterday. It was something chosen today. Elias snapped the watch shut. "No." Samuel looked at him. "We're not giving them this ranch." "They outnumber us," Samuel answered. "They expect that. They've got guns. So do honest men." Samuel shook his head. "We're alone." Elias smiled for the first time in days. "No. We only think we are." Without another word he saddled his horse and rode away. Samuel watched him disappear down the snowy road. "Where's he going?" Martha smiled gently. "To collect every kindness he ever planted." By sunset riders began arriving. First came Mrs. Bennett, the widow whose leaking roof Elias had repaired. Her grown sons rode behind her carrying rifles across their saddles. "We heard what happened. We're staying." An hour later another wagon rolled into the yard. It belonged to Mr. Dawson, whose broken axle Elias had fixed beside Miller's Creek. "You helped my family. Now we help yours." Before darkness fully settled, more lanterns appeared across the valley. Farmers. Cowboys. Blacksmiths. Hunters. Families whose children had once found mysterious packages of meat on their porches. Even the school teacher arrived with blankets and hot coffee. Samuel stood speechless. "I didn't ask any of them." Elias quietly answered. "You didn't have to." By midnight the lonely Whitaker ranch no longer looked lonely. Campfires burned across the yard. Men repaired fences. Women prepared food. Young boys filled ammunition belts. Older ranchers rode patrol through the surrounding hills. Hope had returned on horseback. The sheriff arrived shortly before dawn. He listened carefully as Elias spread another map across the kitchen table. "They'll move the cattle through Redstone Canyon," Elias explained. The sheriff frowned. "Why there?" "It narrows. They'll keep the herd together. And they believe nobody's waiting." Samuel looked at the map. "You've studied this country." "I've crossed it enough times." The sheriff nodded slowly. "We'll meet them there." Before sunrise nearly 40 riders left the ranch together. Snow crunched beneath horses' hooves as they rode toward the canyon. No one spoke much. Everyone understood what was at stake. If the rustlers escaped again, they would never stop hunting isolated ranches. As dawn painted the eastern sky pale gold, Elias reached the cliffs overlooking Redstone Canyon. He looked down. There they were. Masked riders. Dozens of stolen cattle. Exactly as he had predicted. The sheriff whispered, "What's the plan?" Elias looked toward the narrow walls of the canyon. "We don't attack first. We move the herd." He pointed toward several dry cedar trees growing along the ridge. Small teams quietly climbed into position. Moments later thin lines of controlled smoke drifted across the canyon entrance. The cattle noticed first. Then Elias gave one long whistle. Far below, the loyal border collie burst from behind a cluster of rocks. The rustlers shouted in confusion. The trained dog darted behind the herd with astonishing speed, steering frightened cattle exactly where Elias intended. Another whistle echoed. Hidden riders emerged from both canyon ridges. Not firing wildly. Not charging recklessly. Instead they slowly closed every escape route. The cattle turned. Thousands of pounding hooves shook the frozen ground. The rustlers suddenly realized something terrifying. The stampede was coming toward them. Panic exploded. Several outlaws abandoned their horses. Others tried turning the herd but failed. Within seconds the stolen cattle thundered directly past them, scattering the gang across the canyon floor. The sheriff's deputies charged. Rifles cracked through the cold morning air. Most shots struck rocks rather than men. Within minutes the surviving rustlers surrendered. Their leader attempted one final escape. He galloped toward the eastern trail. Elias spurred his horse after him. The chase stretched across snowy hills. Both horses raced through frozen creeks. The outlaw glanced backward and fired. The bullet missed Elias by inches. Elias never returned fire. Instead he rode harder. Near a steep riverbank the outlaw's frightened horse slipped on ice. The man crashed violently into the snow. His rifle slid far beyond reach. Before he could stand, Elias had already dismounted. He aimed his revolver but never pulled the trigger. "It's over." The outlaw stared up bitterly. "You should have shot me." Elias slowly lowered the weapon. "I've buried enough men." The sheriff arrived moments later and placed the rustler in chains. By sunset the stolen cattle had returned home. Neighbors cheered as the herd crossed once more beneath the Whitaker Ranch gate. Samuel stood waiting beside the corral. As the final cow entered safely, tears filled his weathered eyes. "You brought them back." Elias removed his hat. "We all did." That evening the entire valley gathered inside the repaired barn. Laughter echoed where loneliness had once lived. Children chased the border collie through fresh hay. Music drifted from an old fiddle someone had brought. Martha looked around in amazement. "I haven't seen this barn full since Daniel's wedding plans." Samuel quietly walked outside. Elias followed. The old man stood beneath the stars. "I need to tell you something." Elias waited. "When Daniel died." Samuel stared across the moonlit pasture. "I stopped praying. I couldn't understand why God would leave two old people alone." His voice trembled. "Every morning I asked why he wouldn't send someone to help us." He looked directly at Elias. "I spent 6 years waiting for an answer." A long silence followed. Then Samuel stepped closer. "I thought I was asking for a ranch hand." He smiled through tears. "But he sent me another son." Elias's composure finally broke. 4 years he had hidden behind silence, guilt, and endless wandering. Now tears rolled freely down his face. "I don't deserve that." Samuel wrapped both weathered arms around him. "Neither did Daniel. But I loved him anyway. So let an old man love another son." Martha quietly joined them. The three stood together beneath the winter sky while snowflakes drifted gently around them. Weeks later, as spring finally reached the valley, green grass slowly covered the burned pasture. New calves filled the fields. Fresh fences stretched across the ranch. Neighbors continued visiting almost daily, no longer because help was needed, but because friendship had returned. One bright afternoon Samuel carried a folded document onto the porch. He handed it to Elias. "What is this?" "The deed." Elias looked up in surprise. "I can't take your ranch." Samuel smiled. "I already decided. This land belongs to the man who fought for it." "You earned it." Martha laughed softly. "And besides, we're too old to argue with you anymore." Elias looked across the ranch one last time. The repaired barns. The healthy cattle. The loyal border collie chasing laughing children through fresh spring grass. The porch where two elderly people now smiled instead of mourned. Months earlier he had arrived carrying nothing except an exhausted horse, a patched coat, and memories he wished to escape. Now he possessed something no trail had ever given him. A family. As the sun slowly disappeared behind the Wyoming mountains, Samuel settled into his rocking chair beside Martha. Together they watched Elias drive the cattle peacefully across the glowing pasture. Martha smiled. "He only asked for a place to stay." Samuel nodded. "And instead?" He watched Elias remove his hat and wave toward the porch. "He gave us back our home." Above the ranch, hundreds of birds crossed the golden evening sky, while below them the cattle grazed quietly on land that would never again belong to loneliness.